On April 27, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson authorized military intervention in the political crisis of the Dominican Republic under the pretext of saving American citizens, as the Caribbean country was heading towards a civil war that was not in the best geopolitical interest of the United States. The main objective of the intervention was to prevent another Cuban-style government in the Caribbean, since the CIA presented Johnson with evidence that foreign-trained communist militants had joined the rebel ranks. However, the rebels' military revolt in the streets of Santo Domingo aimed to restore the democratically elected government of 1963, which had been overthrown by a military coup supported by many of the then rebel soldiers. Within 3 days of arriving in Santo Domingo, paratroopers from the 3rd Brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division advanced into the city. They linked up with the advanced elements of the 6th Expeditionary Marines Brigade, creating a corridor that divided the city into 2 zones. This action exposed them to a confrontation with the rebels. While military operations to create the security corridor were underway, President Johnson sought the support of the Organization of American States, OAS, to legitimize the intervention. After a debate among Latin American foreign ministers, on May 6th, the OAS approved a resolution to create an Interamerican military force to be sent to Santo Domingo to pressure both sides of the Dominican conflict to desist from escalating their political objectives and to avoid a civil war that could spread throughout the Dominican Republic, as the conflict was mainly confined to the capital, Santo Domingo. The Interamerican military force comprised soldiers from Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Brazil, and Paraguay. The American troops in Santo Domingo became part of this force, commanded by Brazilian General Hugo Alvim. General Bruce Palmer from the U.S. Army was his second in command, leading the American troops in the Dominican Republic. By the end of May, most Latin American troops had arrived in Santo Domingo, assisted by American, Brazilian, and Venezuelan military. In response, the American government withdrew most of its Marine units, leaving the paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division as their main force inside. This decision was made to show that the American troops' mission was, in quotes, a peace mission sponsored by the OAS. The presence of Latin American troops, instead of being welcomed by the rebels, as Johnson's advisors thought, sparked a propaganda campaign against them, especially against the Brazilians. On June 1st, Brazilian Marines took custody of the National Palace, replacing the loyalist forces that had occupied the Dominican government headquarters since April 27th. Meanwhile, that day, American paratroopers took control of the power plant that supplied electricity to the city near the rebel-controlled areas in the colonial zone. General Palmer planned to expand the security zones near the international corridor and take control of this vital objective, thus controlling the city's electricity supply. However, this action led to the battle that this video is about. On June 10th, the rebels negotiated with the Interamerican force to withdraw American troops from the power plant and oppose Palmer's demand to expand the security zone. However, the negotiations collapsed as the rebels thought the Americans wanted to isolate them further, which was the real reason they decided to attack the foreign troops 4 days later. In the late afternoon of June 14th, a group of armed civilians among the rebels attacked a Brazilian position in the security corridor, apparently without authorization. Rebel leader Colonel Francisco Caamaño apologized that night to the Brazilian embassy. This action showed Palmer that Caamaño could not control his decentralized forces, as many of them were armed civilian groups commanded by radical communists with their political objectives. Aside from the rebels' legitimate democratic aspirations to restore the democratically elected government of 1963. Caamaño's excuse was to mask the offensive launched by the rebels at dawn on June 15th. The attack began with a small exchange between a group of armed civilians and a Brazilian-controlled security corridor post. As minutes passed, the attack was supported by 4 outdated Swedish-made L-60 light tanks and mortar fire. The rebel attack spread to other Brazilian and American positions along the corridor, leading to Duarte Bridge. Initially, the American paratroopers thought they were facing routine rebel incursions. Still, within an hour, they realized they were facing a sizable offensive. However, it was poorly organized to penetrate the corridor's defenses. The Brazilian and American soldiers responded to repel the attack under their combat rules. Even so, General Robert York, commander of the American paratroopers, quickly devised a plan to clear the corridor area of rebels. By midday, he received permission from Alvin and Palmer to go on the offensive. Paratroopers from the 1st Battalion of the 508th Airborne Brigade spearheaded the attack, supported by elements of the 2nd Battalion of the 505th Airborne Brigade. They did not have tanks and relied on jeeps equipped with 106mm recoilless rifles and some armed with M60 machine guns. York's surprise attack caught the rebels off guard. The Americans usually stayed behind their elaborate sandbag barricades along the security corridor and never dared to go beyond them. The paratroopers quickly advanced into rebel-controlled territory and, after heavy resistance, managed to advance several dozen blocks in 2 hours. This rapid show of force disrupted the rebels' coordination to defend their territories, as most were armed civilians with no military training, and this time, they were facing well-trained soldiers instead of the Dominican army. Given the successful advance, Alvin and York coordinated another push toward the rebels' headquarters in the colonial zone of Santo Domingo. Still, Brazilian troops were ordered to stay behind their barricades, and only the American paratroopers advanced. As the American troops advanced into rebel territory, news of the battle reached the White House. President Johnson immediately ordered General Palmer to halt the advance as it made the United States appear as the aggressor, an image he did not want to project internationally. General Palmer could not reach York through the radio, who personally was leading the offensive at the front. Then Palmer drove a jeep himself unescorted to where the paratrooper commander was to order the attack's halt. Alvin and York opposed the idea but complied with the order. However, York ordered his paratroopers not to withdraw from the occupied streets, a plan Palmer agreed with since York's attack plan gave more territory to the expanded security zone he had been negotiating with the rebels 4 days earlier. The insurgents had lost about 50% of their controlled city territory in just 5 hours. When the advance was halted, American paratroopers were only 11 blocks from the rebel headquarters in the heart of the colonial zone. York told Palmer, "If you hadn't stopped my paratroopers, this crisis would have ended in 2 more hours." The next day, June 16, the rebels tried to regain lost territory. Still, the Brazilian and American troops had secured their positions without losing a single block. Colonel Camaño complained in a news conference with international journalists about the attack and blamed the American troops for initiating it. This is also how Dominican history refers to this battle, the only and last offensive American troops made during the military intervention. The United Nations observer team that arrived in Santo Domingo days after the event demanded the return of the lost territory to the rebels, which General Alvin refused. The retention of rebel territory by the Interamerican force reduced the rebel stronghold. It provided psychological pressure that later led the rebels to negotiate a resolution to the crisis that suited American political objectives. As for casualties, American military data estimated that the rebels had 99 dead and over 100 wounded during the 2 days of this urban battle. However, some sources estimate these numbers to be higher. The Brazilians suffered 5 wounded. There were 31 wounded American paratroopers, 3 of whom died from their injuries. Civilian casualties in the battle area are unknown. Still, it is estimated that over 100 people were wounded or killed during the fighting. This conflict exemplifies the complexities of international military interventions and the human costs involved. In particular, the Dominican military revolt was an episode that demonstrated American geopolitical power during the Cold War in Latin America. If you like this content, please share it. And if you want us to investigate a topic you want to know about, please mention it in your comments. Remember to subscribe to support our channel.